K-19, Soviet Northern Fleet. On the 4th of July 1961, the Soviet submarine K-19 was conducting exercises in the North Atlantic off the southeastern coast of Greenland. She was the first Soviet submarine designed to carry nuclear ballistic missiles, and she had been built in a hurry. Before she was even launched, 10 civilian workers and a sailor had died in fires and accidents during her construction. At 4:15 a.m. local time, the pressure in the cooling system of the starboard reactor dropped to zero. A pipe in the primary coolant loop had ruptured. The control rods slammed in, but decay heat from the reactor core kept rising. Reactor temperature climbed toward 800 degrees Celsius, which was close to the melting point of the fuel rods, and the submarine had no backup cooling system, even though engineers had asked for one. A separate failure had also disabled the long-range radio, and the commander gave the order to improvise. Crews of 2 and 3 men wearing only raincoats and gas masks entered the reactor compartment in short shifts to weld a new coolant line out of an air vent and a water pipe. The jury-rigged system worked and the reactor cooled, but radioactive steam had already made it through the ship's ventilation, contaminating the entire submarine. 8 of the men who had entered the reactor compartment died of acute radiation sickness within 3 weeks. 14 more crewmen died over the next 2 years. The Soviet Navy gave K-19 a nickname. They called her Hiroshima, USS Thresher. On the 10th of April, 1963, USS Thresher was conducting deep-diving sea trials about 220 miles east of Cape Cod, Massachusetts. She was the lead ship of a new class of fast-attack submarines, which were the most advanced boat in the U.S. Navy. Aboard were 129 men, 96 enlisted crew, 12 officers, 16 shipyard personnel from Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, and a handful of contractors and observers. She was operating in tandem with the submarine rescue ship USS Skylark, communicating via underwater telephone. Thresher had begun her dive in the early morning and reached test depth, which was around 1,300 feet by about 9 a.m. At 9:13 a.m., Skylark received a transmission reporting a minor difficulty and an attempt to blow ballast. A few minutes later, a garbled message came through and the words "exceeding test depth" were heard. Then the line went quiet. At 9:18, an underwater microphone array detected the sound of Thresher's pressure hull imploding. She had passed crush depth, somewhere around 2,400 feet before collapsing. The entire submarine was destroyed in less than a tenth of a second. The Navy's Court of Inquiry concluded that a leak in a silver-brazed joint in the engine room had likely caused a short circuit, shutting down the reactor and crippling the ship's ability to surface. A later acoustic analysis pointed instead to an electrical failure in the bus that powered the main coolant pumps. What is not disputed is that her main ballast tank blow system, designed to push water out of the tanks and bring the ship to the surface, had iced up and failed. The wreck lies in over 8,000 feet of water. The disaster forced the creation of the SubSafe program, the most rigorous submarine quality control system in the world. No SubSafe certified American submarine has been lost since. USS Scorpion. On the 22nd of May, 1968, the American attack submarine USS Scorpion was returning to Norfolk, Virginia, after a deployment to the Mediterranean and a brief surveillance mission near the Azores. Her last reported position placed her about 50 miles south of the Azores. She was due back at Norfolk on the 27th of May, but she never arrived. Families gathered on the pier in the rain, but they were sent home with no explanation. By the 5th of June, the Navy formally declared the submarine and her crew presumed lost. In late October, the research ship USNS Mazar finally located the wreckage about 400 miles southwest of the Azores, under more than 9,800 feet of water. The hull was in pieces on the seabed and the sail had torn free. The reactor compartment had been thrown clear. Acoustic data from the Navy's underwater listening system showed that Scorpion had suffered a sudden internal explosion shortly after 6:20 p.m. on the 22nd of May, followed about 22 minutes later by the implosion of her pressure hull as she sank past crush depth. The Navy's Court of Inquiry could not determine the cause with certainty. The leading theory inside the service was that one of her own torpedoes had malfunctioned, with a battery cell overheating or a Mark 37 torpedo activating inside its tube. Other analysts have argued that hydrogen gas vented from the main battery ignited and ruptured the hull. A small minority of researchers have pushed the theory that the Soviets sank her in retaliation for the loss of their submarine K-129 2 months earlier, but the U.S. Navy has denied this. More than 5 decades on, no investigation has produced a definitive answer, and the wreck of USS Scorpion is still on the floor of the Atlantic, with her 2 nuclear-tipped torpedoes and her reactor still aboard. K-278 Komsomolets. On the 7th of April 1989, the Soviet submarine K-278 Komsomolets was running submerged at a depth of around 335 meters, about 100 nautical miles southwest of Bear Island, in the Norwegian Sea between mainland Norway and the Arctic. Komsomolets was a one-of-a-kind boat. Her titanium hull had taken her to a record depth of 1,020 meters 5 years earlier, which was deeper than any combat submarine before or since. At around 11 a.m., a fire broke out in the engineering compartment, which was almost certainly caused by an electrical short circuit. The watertight doors were sealed, but the fire spread through cable penetrations in the bulkheads, and compressed air from a damaged line fed the flames. The reactor scrammed. Propulsion failed. 11 minutes after the fire began, the crew performed an emergency ballast tank blow, and the submarine surfaced. But by then, the hull had been compromised, and Komsomolets was now burning on the surface in the freezing Arctic Sea. The crew abandoned ship. Many made it into the water wearing only their working uniforms. The water temperature was approximately 2 degrees Celsius. Komsomolets sank about 5 hours after the fire began, taking 5 men down with her in a malfunctioning escape capsule. Of those 5, only 1 survived the ascent. By the time the floating fish factory reached the survivors, 81 minutes after the sinking, most of the men in the water had died of hypothermia. Of the 69 aboard, 42 were killed, but only 4 had been killed directly by the fire and smoke. The rest had frozen to death waiting for a rescue ship that arrived too late. The wreck lies on the floor of the Norwegian Sea at a depth of 1,680 meters. K-141 Kursk. On the 12th of August 2000, the Russian Oscar II-class submarine Kursk was preparing to fire dummy torpedoes at a Russian nuclear battlecruiser as part of a major naval exercise in the Barents Sea. At 11:28 a.m. local time, a hydrogen peroxide leak inside one of the practice torpedoes, traced to a faulty weld, triggered a small explosion in the forward torpedo room. 2 minutes and 15 seconds later, the heat set off the warheads of several other torpedoes. The second blast registered 4.2 on the Richter scale and was picked up by seismic stations as far away as Alaska. It tore the front of the submarine apart. Kursk sank to the seabed at a depth of 108 meters, and most of the crew were killed instantly. But 23 men in the rear of the boat survived the explosions and gathered in the turbine room at the stern. The captain on board wrote a note in the dark, listing the names of all 23 men. Russian Navy commanders who had felt the explosions on nearby ships did not begin a search for more than 6 hours. They publicly insisted nothing was wrong, while the men in compartment 9 were still alive. The Russian government refused offers of British and Norwegian assistance for 5 days. By the time foreign divers were finally allowed to open the rear escape hatch, the compartment was flooded and everyone inside was dead. The men had survived for at least 6 hours. Investigators concluded that as oxygen ran low, the survivors tried to replace a chemical oxygen cartridge. It fell into seawater pooling on the floor and ignited a flash fire that consumed the remaining oxygen. All 118 men aboard the Kursk died. Chinese submarine 361. On the 16th of April 2003, the Chinese Navy diesel-electric submarine number 361 was returning to base after a training exercise in the Yellow Sea, near the inner Changshan Islands off the coast of northeastern China. There were 70 men aboard, including 13 trainee cadets from the Naval Academy, which was more than her standard complement. To recharge her batteries, the boat needed to run her diesel engines while drawing air from the surface through a snorkel. According to the most widely reported account, the snorkel valve closed, possibly because of rough seas, and the diesel engines failed to shut off. With the boat sealed and the engines still running, the diesels consumed the available oxygen inside the submarine in a matter of minutes. The negative pressure made it impossible to open the hatches. There was no distress signal because the crew had no time to send one. Because the exercise was conducted under strict radio silence, the Chinese Navy assumed the boat's lack of communication was normal. For 10 days, no one realized anything was wrong. On the 25th of April, Chinese fishermen noticed a periscope drifting just above the surface and reported it to the Navy. 2 ships were sent to investigate. When sailors boarded submarine 361, they found all 70 men dead at their stations. The crew had not had the time, or perhaps the warning, to move from where they had been working when the air ran out. China's Central Military Commission dismissed or demoted 5 senior officers, including the commander and political commissar of the entire Navy. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe and feel free to drop any video suggestions in the comments.